welcome everybody to our Bold Voices Part 2 at home in a different type of style, but I think it's going to be a very, very good conversation that we have today. We are joined by Trevell Anderson, entertainment journalist, all of the things that I will let them give you. We've been working with Trevell on our past or our upcoming Insights report called Spectrum, really taking a look at the spectrum of the LGBTQ plus community through the lens of Black and Latinx individuals in the community, which we think is so important. So I am going to pause and thank you for Trevell for getting up early in the morning and on West Coast time for us, but please give them more about you, what you've done, and then we'll take it from there.
Yes, thanks so much for having me. I am currently a freelance entertainment journalist and film critic. I got my start in the industry at the Los Angeles Times. And most recently, I was at Out Magazine as their director of culture and entertainment. And now a lot of the work that I do is just centered around kind of bringing more LGBTQ voices, particularly those that are Black, that are Latinx, that are more marginalized, into conversations around diversity, representation, etc.
Yes. And I have to say, it would be remiss of me to say that Trevell is a fellow Morehouse graduate, like Amaya and I, a Morehouse College graduate, and really a mentor. Let me just get deeper there. We've worked together in many different spaces. So I'm excited to have this conversation and also to work with you again this year,
Yes.
for which you did a very, very great job and brought some very good voices there. So let's just hop into Spectrum, okay? Um, let's talk about choosing the voices for Spectrum. I know that we came to you early in the game, but we had already had kind of an outline to start, but you definitely chose great voices to inject in those pieces and bring them to life. And how did you choose those?
Yeah, so I think historically, when it comes to like these types of reports about, our communities, marginalized communities, it often takes like an anthropological approach, and by that I mean it's often people outside of the community coming into the community to tell our stories without, members of our communities actually being able to give the necessary perspective on the varying issues. And so when it comes to Spectrum, I really wanted to make sure that we had a host of voices that have lived experience in terms of some of the things that we are discussing, and making sure that we are not only putting a focus on the white LGBTQ perspective, which more often than not happens with these types of insights reports, and making sure that some of the communities that are the most marginalized within the LGBTQ umbrella also have kind of their voices and their perspective represented. So you'll see in the report a lot of voices. We have trans folks, we have Black queer folks, we have non-binary folks sharing kind of their experiences existing and moving through the world.
Yeah. And I think, for us, some of the stories and definitely the people really gave a good perspective and a deep perspective to some of the insight reports that we talked about. Did you have any favorite ones when you were editing them? I know we talked to like Darnell Moore at Netflix, and we had people like Char Says So, so many different people across the spectrum. Which one were your favorite?
Yeah, I think my favorite is actually, our kind of introduction piece for the entire report. And that's written by Nico Lang, who is an award-winning journalist that covers LGBTQ rights issues. And it talks about like the history of advertising to the LGBTQ community, about the rainbow wave, which we now see of a lot of corporations kind of employing use of the rainbow as a form of marketing to our communities, and then the strength of the pink dollar, right, which is the term given to our community's buying power. And I think that piece kind of even taught me a little bit about kind of the history as it pertains to advertising to our community. It talks about how in 1992, IKEA, the Swedish, furniture retailer, actually received like bomb threats for airing a television ad in the East Coast markets that featured a gay couple. And it was like one of the first times that a brand advertised in that way, in terms of using television, but how that kind of demonstration of their support of the community led to, at that time, really great, profits for the company that year. There's also a story in the piece about Subaru, the car Subaru,
Mhm.
and how they were one of the first companies to recognize that lesbians in particular were like 4 times more likely to buy their cars than heterosexual people. And so they started engaging in what we called um, uh, gay window advertising, which is basically like baking in or like hiding in these references that queer people will recognize
Mhm.
as a form of saying that you support the community. And so for Subaru, they would have license plates that reference Xena Warrior Princess, which has a major queer community, or they'd have a license plate that says P Town, which is a nickname for Provincetown, which is a popular, gay location at Cape Cod's tip. And what you find is that a lot of these demonstrations, particularly by Subaru, but by other companies as well, have maintained kind of a presence in the community. So
Yeah.
polls today show that like Subaru is still a major brand supported by LGBTQ people because of the ways that they were kind of, at the beginning stages representing and marketing to the community. So I would say that's probably one of my favorite pieces for the kind of historical context it brings to this conversation.
Nice. It definitely was one of my favorite pieces. I think he ended it with, or what was it? In this case, what would Subaru do, or something like that. That's the
Yes.
insight, and I think that that's a really good insight. And really, for the IKEA one, I was shocked too because I did not know that there were bomb threats. I didn't know that IKEA, for one, would be the brand to take such a bold stance. 20 years ago or something. So
Yeah.
definitely interesting to me. Did you have any other favorite ones? I can say for me, I definitely like um, Shar says so. I think that's trans visibility and commercialization. Um,
Yes.
I think I loved definitely the dictionary for sure. And I think that that's going to be and I know you wrote that piece, but that's going to be a
Yes.
very interesting one for people because when we go into having people understand even the definitions of gender versus sexuality, right? It's
Hmm.
completely, I'd say for some in companies, foreign to what they think about and what they do.
Yeah.
And really, we've gotten some feedback. We don't address things because we don't know, right? And I think that the dictionary really slaps it in their face and says, like, you have to know, it's no reason to be ignorant. Did you have any other pieces?
Yeah, I mean, I would add to both of those. I really enjoyed working with the myself writing the LGBTQ dictionary and then working on the essay from Shar Jossel, known online as Shar Says So, who does a lot of work around trans representation. I also would highlight, we have an essay by TT Toops
Yes.
called Who Gets to Bring Their Whole Self to Work, that talks about their experience being a non-binary person in the workplace
Yeah.
and the different ways that companies can actually support their trans and gender nonconforming folks in the workplace. I think that's an area of this conversation that doesn't really get a lot of talk, a lot of attention.
Yeah.
And so with that piece, we're able to highlight from an individual's perspective who's going through the particular experience right now, the different things that would help them kind of better ingratiate themselves into a particular work environment.
Yeah. And I think that that piece from TT really gives some uh, actionable insights, right? When you think about like policy based insights that all companies can use ASAP, I think that that was a perfect piece to go there. And then let's go into even some insights from like Darnell Moore at Netflix, which I thought was great, or even Stephen Canals at Pose, which I thought was two. When I say thank you for those very heavy hitters there. And did you have any thoughts around the Stephen Canals piece or even what Darnell said? Actually, I'm gonna pull it up just because I had it.
Yeah. So I mean, I would say with the Stephen Canals piece that's written by Dr. John Paul Higgins, that is the story of Pose coming to life by this, Latinx man who was very familiar with the ballroom and voguing community in New York, where he's from. We get a little bit of his background and his story in the piece written by John Paul Higgins, as well as the difficulties expertise in trying to tell a story that, you know, for all intents and purposes, centers Black and brown trans women. And Stephen
Mhm.
Canals is not a Black or brown trans woman. And so he talks about the efforts that he took, along with Ryan Murphy's support, to make sure that trans people were in the writer's room, to make sure that they were casting primarily Black and brown trans folks, some from the community, some outside of the community, to play the different characters on
Yeah.
screen. And then more so, his advice for other creators interested in telling stories that, you know, may not necessarily be their own, but they want to be an ally and support the telling of these particular community stories. So really enjoyed that piece. And then when it comes to, we did a Q&A with Darnell Moore, who helps oversee inclusion and diversity for Netflix, longtime author, longtime community advocate. A lot of his insights, I think, as someone doing the work and now doing it from kind of a corporate space, and a tech space at that, I think his interview is really illustrative of how a lot of the work that we see being done on the ground in terms of activists within the community can
Mhm.
also similarly be kind of extrapolated and placed into a corporate context, especially because oftentimes I think we see activists and folks who are within a particular company as opposing entities, when in
Yeah.
reality there's a lot of kind of co-working that can take place.
For sure, especially I think within this DEI journey, which is interesting even for bold culture, like at Morehouse, talking about social justice and even going through all of that and going into corporate worlds and understanding that this is what they're doing, but they're trying to put it in a different way, right? And it's kind of
Yes.
trying to translate it. And it doesn't have to be translated. It's activism in the workforce that's extended to for people to actually do better, be treated better, right? So like it's the same mission there. I think what you mentioned with Stephen Canals, where I wanted to highlight, he said, at the end of the day, I'm borrowing from someone's lived experience. I'm fighting not to co-opt the story while making sure that that story is told. I have to remember that I am borrowing a story. I am borrowing a life. I have to make sure that those stories don't become commodified. You have to also ensure that you are supporting those individuals whose story it is, like finding a way for them to be involved in the process of telling the story, or finding a way for them to also be economically supported by the work, so that they are not just appropriating a story and commodifying their life and their narrative. I thought that was such a great piece because it's something that, or have you seen instances where that is true?
Very much so. I mean, I think more often than not, when we see LGBTQ stories, Black stories, brown stories, disabled stories, etc., oftentimes the people telling those stories don't look like us. They don't come from our communities. And while there isn't anything inherently bad about that, where the faults come into place is when you don't have, you're not figuring out ways to empower members of that community and to bring them into the fold so that they can, economically speaking, right, benefit from the telling of their stories. So what we see with Pose, for example, is they have a Black trans woman in their writers room, right, Janet Mock, right? And from there, from her time being a writer and now a producer and now a director of Pose, she now has her own production deal at
Mhm.
Netflix, right? And so there's a system, there's a pipeline that's created when we bring in people who traditionally don't have access to these certain types of industries and certain types of spaces, that allows them to economically benefit. And then from there, the folks that are actually employed to tell these stories, right? So whether that's MJ Rodriguez or India Moore or Dominique Jackson, Angelica Ross, Haley Sahar, a lot of these folks, some of them did not have prior acting experience, or they had limited acting experience in advance. And now you see so many of them have gone on to book other gigs, to book other jobs, to become cover models, to get other types of deals because of the work that they've been doing on Pose. And so if we can figure out how to, if the allies, the people who aren't of these communities who want to tell some of our stories, if they can figure out how to have those platforms kind of serve as trampolines, if you will, for folks into other opportunities, I think that's the way that we kind of do some coalition building
Yeah,
to ensure that appropriation isn't taking place.
You
completely.
kind of touched on exactly what I kind of have a question about, which is completely a caveat. We are, but kind of off subject, but on subject. I think as we go into Pride Month, and we are in this space where things have to be digital, a lot of brands are going to have to rely on LGBTQIA plus talent to kind of create their own campaigns.
Mhm.
What are some resources and or strategies that you may have for other talent who don't have that experience to maybe try to get into these doors to tell their story and add some authenticity to these campaigns so they're not told from a
Yeah.
very perspective?
I mean, I think ultimately what I would say from the talent side of things and folks who want to be kind of in service in that particular role, I think ultimately it's about doing the work, right? I think it's about not necessarily looking for or expecting the biggest check or the biggest spotlight on you at this point, because what I find more often than not are the people that do get have gotten the opportunities, right? There are folks who have kind of sowed that goodwill in terms of the work that they're doing in the community. So, right, a lot of the more prominent trans folks that you see now, they actually were like activists within their local community. They were, part of acting workshops, or they were Angelica Ross had her own technology equipment services organization directed at trans folks, and was doing the work while also doing side work working on her acting. And so I think it's about kind of developing your own uh, grasp and your own expertise within the community in terms of the work that you do in that advocacy work. And then on the other end, in terms of brands kind of moving into this digital age when it comes to Pride in a few days, I guess, I think ultimately the approach shouldn't change. I think for the Pride campaigns that we've seen and the expressions of solidarity and support that we've seen from certain companies, particularly for LGBTQ communities, the ones that work will continue to work even now that we're digital, right? And that's because they weren't necessarily just interested in the attention that comes from being a sponsor of a Pride parade or a sponsor of a float at Pride. They were interested in actually supporting the community, right? Is to, they want to have their logo on the step and repeat with all the people taking, their selfies. That is their goal. They're not interested in helping LGBTQ community. They're not interested in putting money directly into LGBTQ people's pockets, right? And so I would say what's needed is all of these budgets that all of these companies had in place for their Pride campaigns that they might not necessarily be using for Pride at this point. Figure out ways where you can put that money actually into the community's pockets, right? So whether that's finding some LGBTQ influencers, we have a list of them in the Insights report that you can use to figure out how to, lift up your brand, but also lift up these LGBTQ people. I think that's a great route. I think figuring out what type of LGBTQ organizations that they could be diverting said money that they planned on these Pride campaigns to, that is a good approach. Especially now we see that, Miss Corona is impacting Black and Brown communities, LGBTQ communities, disabled folks, etc., disproportionately as compared to, our white counterparts. And so now is the time to really double down on this support that these companies say that they have for our community.
For sure. And I think that's as powerful because you don't have you don't have the room to do these big productions, right? Even from a Nike perspective, who, we at Bold, we really love Nike as one of the brands that have been pushing out very inclusive campaigns, but that production has to be shifted, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
think we're working with even, some people connected, like, oh, how do we reach the community online? It's like, give to the community. That's always, for me, the best options, like give, right? And there's always need there. So love that. And I'm actually going to go from there then to, what are some of your favorite LGBTQ media brands, I'd say first?
Yeah, LGBTQ media brands. So I'm going to give you a mixture. I'm going to first start with some of the more independent nonprofit media brands that are out there, and then go to some of the larger, more mainstream LGBTQ legacy, publications and brands. So first, I want to shout out Soul, soul.lgbt. That's SOULE.LGBT is their website. They are a independent publication, particularly interested in reporting and covering our community from the Black LGBTQ perspective.
Mhm.
And so the majority of their writers identify as Black LGBTQ folks. Their editors identify as Black LGBTQ folks. And the coverage that they do is with that perspective in mind. There's also a nonprofit organization called Color Block. That's BLOQ. Colorblock.org. And they have a digital magazine as well as some educational initiatives and digital conversations that they've been doing, particularly in this time, catering toward queer and trans people of color, written by queer and trans people of color, and led by queer and trans people of color. So shout out to those two entities. And then I always give a shout out to blogger Monica Roberts, also known as Trans Griot, who has been doing a lot of the work around chronicling the Black trans experience, and focusing on the community, hyper focus on the community in that way. So those are like three kind of independent, smaller brands that I would just highlight. Deserve more attention, deserve more support, whether in terms of subscriptions, whether that's advertising dollars, sponsorship buyouts, etc. And then on the larger scale, you have your entities that everyone knows, such as The Advocate, my former employer, Out Magazine, that definitely need support in terms of subscribers, in terms of advertising and sponsorship dollars, especially because we see a lot of times the bigger publications that represent our community aren't necessarily led by members of our community. And unfortunately, that leads to a lot of mismanagement of funds, that leads to a lot of mismanagement of personnel, and it really endangers the legacy and the future of these brands that, since their beginning have paved the way for how we as a community have kind of moved through society. So I just think, it's important that when we talk about LGBTQ media brands, that we are ensuring that there is kind of substantive support provided to them. Like,
Yeah.
clicks help, retweets and shares help, but ultimately they need the coin
Yeah.
in order to keep going. And then we do have in the Insights report, we do have 2 queer media spotlights on Autostraddle, which is a website that focuses on queer women. And then we have a spotlight on Slay TV, which is a kind of broadcast digital outfit that focuses on the Black LGBTQ perspective.
Yeah, and I think that portion of having LGBTQ media is one, but substantial, support is important because, and this is why we're having the conversation. Advertisers, when they have a particular brand, it's either, let's say June is a very good month, maybe for LGBTQ media brands, but trying to extend that throughout the year becomes the problem. And for us, we understand that it's one that education in need, right? If there's an education that the LGBTQ community is a spectrum, and hey, we are here outside of June, right? And you can communicate to people outside of just saying it's Pride Month, versus them just having the mandate from their clients, which is we only want to focus on this community in June, right? So that's always the battle. And we think that Spectrum is helping advertisers and also their clients really reshape what it means to kind of reach and talk about LGBTQ creators, the community at large. I'm thinking, just going back to creators, who are some of the, go ahead.
You're about to ask a question that I want to piggyback off of.
Okay.
Darren's going to ask about what are some influencers and or creators that are from the community that you would like to highlight. I will also like to piggyback off of that and ask, how can brands support influencers and or creators from the LGBTQIA plus community that may not have the cleanest quote unquote brand or the most mainstream quote unquote brand, but they have the reach that companies really need tap into to get to the main audience that they need to. Just for example, like someone like T.S. Madison, who, you know, is associated with sex work or, you know, all of those type of things. But T.S. Madison has over 500,000 people following her on multiple platforms. So it's like, if we're trying to get to the community, she would be a person that I would want to get to, but brands don't think like that, so to speak.
Yeah.
Well, what is a way that you would, what some advice you would give to brands to maybe get over that hump of brand safety,
Yeah.
but also, you know, extend their reach?
Yeah, well, so first and foremost, I would say that yes, more often than not, a lot of these brands, when they're thinking of marketing to LGBTQ people, they specifically think about the month of June because it's Pride Month, right? Or if you're here in California, maybe they'll think about November because November is Palm Springs Pride, right? However, LGBTQ people exist and move through the world outside of the month of June as well. And so, you know, and so I think it's important to figure out other ways where you can actually market to LGBTQ people without like just throwing a rainbow on something, right? And so that's using LGBTQ talent and creators in your, you know, in your Mother's Day campaign, in your Father's Day campaign, in your, you know, Labor Day campaign, you know, anything, Arbor Day, you know, whichever ones, right? We exist and move through the world in the exact same ways as everyone else. So like, I think that's another way that companies can cater to the community without having to do something that's specifically LGBTQ oriented. And then in terms of attaching a company attaching themselves to somebody who might not have, you know, the most pristine background, I think one thing that's important to note is how we as a society are changing hearts and minds and ideas about certain things, such as sex work, right? Such as, you know, even folks that like are recovering from different substance abuses and things like that, and that's a part of their story. I would challenge brands to figure out ways where you can actually use that person's background to your benefit, right? And so whether that is, you mentioned T.S. Madison, I think she's a great example of someone who actually, you know, she doesn't hide her past as, you know, a sex worker. She actually very much owns it. But now she's focused on doing something different. And I think it's important for us, both on the brand side as well as the broader society side, to allow people to grow and to allow people to change, and to also realize that for a lot of these folks, particularly when we're talking about sex work, they engaged in this type of work because they needed to, right, as a form of survival. And so to say that you won't work with a certain person because of their sex worker past really is problematic, and it's kind of continuing some of these social ills that we that many people say that they're trying to, right, you know, fight against. In terms of LGBTQ influencers and creators that I think, you know, people should be paying attention to, T.S. Madison is a great example. I think, you know, Zach Campbell, who is a YouTuber, Terrell Grice, who is a YouTuber, they're really great examples of people who have a great grasp not only on other LGBTQ people, but also non-LGBTQ audience as well, in terms of folks that they should be reaching out to. And then I love to always highlight folks who can do hosting different events, folks who can, as writers, who can help you, you know, maybe craft some content on the inside as consultants and advisors. And so whether that's folks like, you know, Michael Street, who is currently at Out Magazine, he is a ballroom expert, and he does a lot of work around, you know, sex and kink communities, right? Heron Walker, who does a lot of reporting around trans folks and trans communities. Katie Barnes, sports, a non-binary sports reporter, right? You know, these are different folks who I think can be brought into different campaigns, brought into different opportunities with brands, with companies, to really kind of, you know, elevate the work that is trying to be done, but also give a little bit authenticity to it as well.
Yeah, that was a one perfect answer, but very, very, very perfect question too, Ahmad, because it's honestly that question Ahmad asked is something that we are literally getting at Bowl. You know, it's the idea that history then kind of makes it unbrand safe, and that is a disconnect on understanding what the community is in itself, right? And I think
Yeah.
you mentioned it, like the survival tactics for the community. So it's ignorance in itself. I think that I want to go into, I had a question around how we get better reach, but I just really want to talk about the differences of Black and Latinx, the Black and Latinx LGBTQ community. And I hate to say it, but the white or other LGBT communities, right? And how that's so different, both from a culture end, a media end, sometimes even, an interest sometimes. Where do you
Yes.
find the nuance, and have you found that media companies have a hard time in discussing or even illustrating that nuance of Black and Latinx LGBTQ lives?
Very much so. And I think a lot of that is because the people who are doing this work, the people who are being gifted and granted the opportunities to be consultants and advisors on projects, they don't look like us, right? To be quite frank, they are white gay men more often than not. They might be a white lesbian. But in terms of having Black and brown LGBTQ folks serving in these consultant roles, that doesn't happen often. And so what you see is a lot of these campaigns that say they're, catering to the LGBTQ community. By default, it means that they're catering to the white LGBTQ community. And so there ends up being a schism between the white queer folks who will be engaging with the brand and the types of brands that Black and brown LGBTQ folks will be engaging with. And so it ultimately starts at the ideation phase. It starts at the hiring phase within these companies in terms of why some of their campaigns don't really reach as broad of members in the community as possible. And then when you look at the actual numbers, when you look at the actual statistics of our experiences as Black and brown LGBTQ folks, all of the societal ills that even broader LGBTQ people might be facing, we face it harder. We face it doubly, right? Black trans women, for example, receive the brunt of a lot of different, isms and obias, and it creates, as we were talking about T.S. Madison, it creates this need for them to engage in, things that we would consider to be, illicit, forms of activity in order to survive, in order to fend for themselves and provide for themselves. And so I think it's important that we note those similarities without those similarities and those differences without allowing them to be deterrents. I feel like so often when people outside of the community hear this kind of intersectional approach to
Yeah.
to our community, it's like, oh my God, I don't want to step in some shit, so I'm just not going to do it at all.
Yeah.
Right? When in reality, there are plenty folks out here that you can bring on board to help you through this process. If you're going to hire a consultant anyway, why not have someone from the community? Or better yet, why not partner with a nonprofit that is doing the work that can give you this particular advice, right? So often we see these LGBTQ campaigns, perhaps unconsciously subscribing to a white LGBTQ perspective or sentiment in the organizations that they partner with, right? And so this is no shade to the organizations I'm about to name. However, the Trevor Project, GLSEN, GLAAD, HRC, those are organizations that do very great, necessary, important work, but sometimes their work does not reach, Black and brown LGBTQ folks. Sometimes it does not reach, queer and trans folks of color, right? It doesn't reach disabled queer folks, right? And so why not consider, partnering with the Marsha P. Johnson Institute out of New York? Why not consider partnering with, the Transgender Cultural District in San Francisco? Why not consider partnering with Southerners on New Ground, which is a Southern-based LGBTQ organization? There's so many other entities that companies can partner with and work with to ensure that not only their work is getting to as many people in the community as possible, but also making sure that Black and brown LGBTQ people benefit from it as well.
Okay, I was just checking, writing it down as soon as you had all those organizations, because honestly, it's one, I go back to the word ignorance, but it's kind of like a willing for willful ignorance, if you will, right? Like, oh, I can't find it, let me go to the partner that I work with now. We had an experience like that before where it's an LGBTQ health brand, I will say that. And the first person they went to was a health media company completely outside of the community, completely outside of what the community would be following. And I'm sure everything that you said is definitely a solution, but it's also for them to wanting to actually reach out and do it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, reach out and kind of find these extra resources. Go ahead, Amon.
But then it's also like, I think for me, how do, playing devil's advocate, a lot
Mm-hmm.
of the brands, their defense mechanism is, oh, the X community isn't listening, or the X community isn't supporting, or the X community isn't present. How can, what advice or what strategies can these brands use beyond partnering with, let's say, with institutions? How do they get into the nitty gritty of these communities to really get, like, reach them where they are? I think
Mm-hmm.
we do have to recognize, yes, not every community is paying attention to some of these prestigious organizations, but they're still interested in the missions that some of these projects may have.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, first of all, really great point. But I think ultimately, we have these conversations and we have, I do a lot of work around, like, newsroom diversity, for example. And so often we hear, oh, we don't know where these people exist. Like, we want to do it, but we don't know how to get to them. When in reality, we make it a very complicated and difficult conversation and difficult approach. But when in reality, it's very simple. Like, go to people, right? Take your company, take your organization, and go to an LGBTQ center that does a lot of work in Black and Brown communities, right? It's really that simple. It is a lot of these companies, they do community service projects and things like that already, right? Why not make the community service organization that you're doing work for an LGBTQ organization that does work in Black and Brown communities? I think there are so many ways to adjust things that are already being done in these corporate spaces to ensure that the work and the efforts that are being put behind some of these campaigns actually reach the people that they want them to reach, right? And so it's about, again, maybe it's casting certain people from a particular community in whatever campaign that you want to do, right? We see a good example. You brought up Nike earlier. Nike's a great example. They have for a minute now, right, been particularly with their Be True campaign, which takes place throughout the entire year, employing and putting a spotlight on a variety of members throughout the LGBTQ community, with a particular focus on a number of, like, Black and Brown folks, right? So whether that's Leomi Maldonado, who is a voguer and choreographer from the ballroom scene, right? Who, is, one of the legendary members of that scene. Plucking her and recognizing her as Nike, this major athletic brand, recognizing her style of dance as a form of athleticism, the community responds to that, right? Or whether it's Karan Clement. Karan Clement is another one of their Be True folks who actually came out late last year, and but he had already had the backing of Nike, and he was able to, like, they did a donation here in LA of a new track at one of the local community colleges, and the track is, like, rainbow colored, right? There are different ways, I think, to make sure that the work that is being done hits the people that you want it to hit, but it's ultimately about, like, getting out there. It's about getting out of your comfort zone. It's about being willing to, make mistakes. Ultimately, a lot of folks who engage in these conversations, they want to tiptoe around certain things,
Mm-hmm.
and they're just unsure about how to go about things. And that's why I say, again, hire the right people. Don't just hire the people that hire the people who can get you into these communities, so that when your work is put out there, those communities will respond. I hope that answered your question.
No, yeah, that did. That did. I think, just to piggyback, I think I just remember that day Leomi's video was released, and I think it really was so touching to see because it was so authentic. It came from a very uh, deep and rooted space where you can hear Precious chanting this beautiful, like, almost poem, and it's just like, that was not done. It's not just about, oh, she's dancing. It was like her struggles and her athleticism is in the scene and outside of the scene. It's something that she goes through every day. So I think, adding on to your answer, I think part of, just tapping into these communities in the nitty gritty ways. It also has to be authentic. It can't be like, oh, one day I'm at the Trevor Project and I'm straight to them again. It's just, I can't go from the Trevor Project to going to the ballroom scene. Like, it has to be some type of
Right.
authentic way of making that connect and coming off in a very believable way, and not just like I'm trying to check a box.
I agree. Trevell, I wanted to actually ask because around the work that we're talking about, of course, is on the media, I mean, the brand side, but
Mm-hmm.
just as important is the media side, right? This is a whole, advertising can't survive without media. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's the thing. As the president of the NABJ LA chapter, and I know you mentioned doing a lot of work to bring in Black and brown voices to newsrooms. What has been your experience? Can you expound on that a bit? I know you mentioned before. What's your experience even in that lane, right? We're focused on advertising, but we know media, tech, like we're trying to solve all of that, and we know that there are some nuances there. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's actually, unfortunately, very similar to some of the conversations that you all might be engaging in, right? That focus on um, a lot of people's, you said it right, willful ignorance about some of these things, right? So NABJ is the National Association of Black Journalists. I'm president of the Los Angeles chapter. I've been president for almost 4 years now.
Okay.
And
Right.
and we are an entity that is supposed to be a resource, not only for our members and the Black journalists across this country, but also for the news media, elite who are interested allegedly in diversifying their newsrooms. But there's always a difficulty in actually getting them to hire our people. And a lot of that connects to these general ideas that our society has about the abilities of Black and brown people, of Black and brown LGBTQ folks, of disabled folks, etc. Right? And so what we find is that, we can have, I'll say on the national level, we can have 300 different media companies come to our national convention every year, get a booth at our career fair, and I'd say less than 10%, less than 5% even maybe of folks actually get jobs from that, right?
Yeah.
And so what we end up finding is a lot of lip service being paid to our experience, being paid to the work that we're trying to do, right? They'll give us a couple coins for a sponsorship of a workshop. Maybe they'll purchase a booth at the career fair, but they still ain't got no Black people in their newsroom, right? It doesn't make sense. And so what we end up finding is a need to champion more voices, more different types of voices in these spaces. And so that means on the media company side, right, that means not only hiring Black and brown folks and giving them an actual job, right? Because what we find is that on the average, Black and brown people end up serving as freelancers for a lot of these media companies, right? And by them only being freelancers, the company doesn't have to pay for health insurance.
Yeah.
They don't have to pay for, all these other necessities really for us to do our job. And so not only do they need to hire folks full time, but those folks that are hired full time need to have a pipeline to greater leadership in these particular spaces. I think this is a great example for a lot of the companies on the ad side, on the tech side, etc., because you can't just, hire Black and brown LGBTQ folks, etc., and keep them at the lowest rung in your organization. You need to empower them. You need to give them the opportunity to eventually lead the company, right? And that is where we see, I think, a lot of disconnect with the efforts that are put in place. But that's how you can see how some of these efforts don't really have any substance behind them.
Yeah. Well, one thing that, as somebody who is a freelancer, coming to the table to put with friends, phrasing this again, as a freelancer and having friends that are freelancers, coming to the table with the certain quote unquote qualifications that someone may need to, reach that executive space. I have the 4 years at X company or 4 years at this agency, whatever. But, my overall experience, let's say if I was a writer, similar to you've been writing for everybody and their mama, but on paper, somebody may say like, oh, well, because Trevell wasn't at this prestigious this or that there, or they may not have a doctor here and doctorate there, whatever. What advice can you give to freelancers to come to the table, be it resume, portfolio, approach, period, to come to the table with a little bit more meat to their past and their work experience, so they can be looked at as a little bit more attractive to these brands?
Yeah, well, so I think a lot of it is about the time investment into the work that we're doing on our own, right? And so even as a freelancer, it's about making sure without a shadow of doubt that the work that you are producing as a freelancer, as a contractor, is good. You know, and I that might come off as real shady,
Yeah.
but but what I mean by that is the work that we do independently of our own accord has to match the quality level of these types of spaces that we say we want to be in, right? So if you want to work with X publication, the work that you're already doing needs to be at that level. Now, there's a whole separate conversation that we can have about what that level means and how that level can, on its face, already be exclusionary and difficult for those of us, right, who maybe you didn't go to X school, maybe you are self-taught. Maybe you've never had a full-time staffed position. A lot of those things can be deterrents. But if the work is good, they can't deny you. I would also say to that end, because they're going to still try to deny you, that it is important that companies and organizations and institutions think bigger and think differently about who they are employing, even if it is on a contract or freelancer level. The thing of what we need more is about I don't want to say taking chances, because I think, you know, people get very nervous about taking the terminology, taking chances, but I think it's about putting faith in more people and different kinds of people. So I will use as a quick example, when I was at Out Magazine, our editor-in-chief was Philip Picardi, who is responsible for a lot of the great changes that happened at Teen Vogue, where he was prior to coming to Out Magazine. He also helped launch Them, which was Condé Nast's LGBTQ outlet. Him coming to a legacy LGBTQ media brand that is Out Magazine, that historically is known for its focus on white queer people. He wanted to do a complete 180. And so he employed Black and brown LGBTQ folks, he employed trans folks, non-binary folks, etc., who can do the work and have been doing the work, but perhaps didn't necessarily have the opportunity to be like staffed at a particular place, right? As our executive editor, he put a Black trans woman in charge, Raquel Willis, who does a lot of great work in the community, particularly when it comes to trans visibility and trans work. And then he had the rest of us in our different, you know, positions. And we had every single type of person possible within the LGBTQ community represented on our staff. And it was very, in terms of the distribution of power, is very kind of like a horizontal structure. And so anyone was able to contribute different ideas to the different, you know, stories that we were putting forth. And what we saw is that allowed us to discover new names, new talents, new people that, you know, perhaps I wasn't aware of. Right. And so not only are we able to have, you know, someone like Micaiah Carter or Collier Shore do our covers, but we're also able to have someone like Quill Lemons, who is a newer, younger photographer, right, also contribute to our covers, right? Same thing in terms of the spreads and the photo shoots on the inside. We were able to diversify the type of people and the types of content that we were bringing into the publication. And so for brands, for companies, I think that's the way to go about it. It's making sure you empower the people of diverse background that you have within your company to give you their ideas, but then to also be okay with seeing talent, seeing promise, seeing potential in folks who might not traditionally, you know, get these different opportunities.
I think
go ahead, Amat.
Adding to what you said, you know, going back to what you mentioned earlier, I think us as people in the queer community, but also Black people in the queer community trying to get to these quote unquote upper echelon positions and working our way up the ladder. I think too often than not, people get fixated on rates and, oh, I'm not going to take this opportunity because of a rate or because I'm not getting the actual dollar that I'm perceived I should get, which is fine, get your coin.
Get your coin.
To a philosophy that my granddad has instilled in me is like, get in the door first, get in the door, be able to do the work, show, improve, and that type of thing. And then show your power, show your, quality, etc. And then be able to have some type of baseline to request things. But I think that idea and perspective today has kind of been thrown out the window on the freelance side because we perceive these companies have money, which they do. I'm not saying that.
Yes.
But I think, sometimes the greater mission of, representation sometimes supersedes dollar. Don't be taken advantage of, but definitely work and try to get in those doors more than ever, like than now.
Yeah, and I think at the same vein though, I do think that there are brands or companies who take that and then they already start at the bottom, right?
They exploit it, yes.
They exploit it. So I think that that's the problem too. It's kind of like we have one instance where people want to get in the door, right? Especially if you're a student, you went to college, the game of the hustle, the hustle pretty well. But if someone starts you at, on the second rung and you're supposed to be on the 10th or 11th, it gets you a harder time of negotiation too, I think. But I think to both of y'all's points, that's where champions and, people who are in the room and bring you up really come into place. Because there are plenty of white people, let's be honest, that don't have the accolades per se, but they may have went somewhere for undergrad and their friend did this. And we understand the connections and networking, but having champions in the workplace allows for us to move forward. So Philip, in that case, Trevell, when you mentioned him, really was the champion to say, look, it doesn't matter if they went to X school or not, or if they had a portfolio. I think they're interesting because look at what they're doing in the culture on Instagram. Look at what they're doing on Twitter. And I think that that's important because there's still recruiters who are trying to figure out, how do I tap into the new culture, the new age, the people who haven't done that yet. I don't really care. You look at Facebook and Google who are saying, we don't care if you went to college, right? You just need to know how to code, or you need to know X, Y, and Z. And I think that this is in a really interesting space where now, with barriers being taken away, we have to ensure that LGBTQ people have access to, honestly, those tools, right? So like, how can we support someone in an LGBTQ way from I'm missing her name. She was on Pose.
Angelica Ross?
Angelica Ross, thank you. I'm gonna cut that out, y'all. But Angelica Ross, for her to have a particular nonprofit that's teaching LGBTQ youth about tech, how can we get more of those? So that person now is working at Google, is working at Facebook and bringing up his sis or her sis and everything else. And I think that's also a way where we can build a coalition.
I think you mentioned it best. Going back to, the great words of Issa Rae.
Yes.
We have to reach across more than just reaching up and down. I think, it's also our mission as people who have some sort of platform and or power, so to speak, to bring new talent on. I think this is the reason why, Bold exists in a way to try to, promote this mission so that people realize, once you get your seat at the table, it's not about, oh, I got my coins, I'm good. I don't have to do any, diligence, community service, whatever you want to call it. But it's bring people in when you can. Do that, passing of the buck, so to speak, so that other people can have those same opportunities that you have versus promoting this crab in the barrel mentality.
Yeah, and I just want to add to what both of you were saying. I think one of the reasons why, sometimes we get exploited in terms of this freelancer conversation and this contractor conversation is because not enough of us talk about money, right? And so, to your point, Ahmad, of like bringing other people with you, it's also about like being open to like talking about money, and saying, hey, I got this amount for this level of work. Now, I was, on my shit when I did it. So maybe you can't get that, but that should help you with a range and like helping people. Like I help people negotiate contracts all the time. I'm very much interested in even with the Spectrum Insights report, right? We have a variety of people of a variety of different experience levels, particularly when it comes to writing, and a variety of different audience reaches in terms of the folks who are giving these insights. And I, just want to say that even in us putting this insights report together, we kind of model this very conversation. A couple of the people, they were great kind of like on air talents, but they had not necessarily had a lot of experience writing. And so we took the time and worked with them on the writing, right? Or we had folks who aren't kind of writers or media personalities at all, who we solicited some and had conversations with about their particular experiences. And so it's about doing the work, right? Both in terms of those of us who are in the freelancer kind of gig economy, but also the people who are inside particular companies and organizations. We all have to be interested in actually doing the work.
So speaking of doing the work, I think this is a great segue into it kind of closing. I think we're kind of at the close. And we talk about representation being a big thing and something that helps bring the industry up. And then actually doing the work is completely different, in my opinion, than representation. Both are important though. So let's go into something like Andre Leon Talley, who introduced you in his book and mentioned you in his book. Have you heard the audio version of that yet?
I have not heard the audio version.
I want to play the full 2 minutes for you. One, because it's history and it's him reading in his voice. And two, I want to ask you two questions. One about how you felt about that as a journalist, and then we'll talk about other stuff. So 1 second.
Before you play it, Darren, say something real. Trevell, I don't understand I know you probably don't understand because I never said this to you, but I am over the moon proud of you for this moment. I don't know if you realize how legendary this is. When you hear it, it's like, it's out of body experience to hear Andre talk about you in such respect and such reverence, which such touching how much you meant to him and how much of an impression you left on him. But I'll let it go.
All right, so let me play it. Let me see if y'all can hear. Can y'all hear?
Yeah.
According to Andre, a young black man in a lineup of reporters waiting to chat with me stood up. His name was Trevell Anderson, and he was entertainment reporter for the Los Angeles Times. Trevell came into the press conference location in a brilliant Ralph Lauren poncho as a Native American Indian blanket, loose black hammer leggings, and high stiletto boots. These boots were nothing compared to his long Chinese Mandarin lacquered nails in bright gold. His hair was groomed into an extravagant Regency Afro poof, with a giant ebony roll in the front that towered to the ceiling, and cut Vidal Sassoon scissor short in the back. This is a man who uses his personal style as a fashion warrior. In Trevell, I saw my younger self. In the moment, I flashed back vividly to interviewing Karl Lagerfeld at the Plaza in 1975. Now here I was, being asked questions about the documentary and my journey. Trevell's intelligence and confidence in the delivery of his questions and the span of his fashion knowledge was breathtaking. It brought me to tears. My heart was full of pride and joy, as though I had just experienced the Hallelujah chorus on a Sunday morning in Missionary Baptist Church. Trevell, only in his 20s, is already on the path to fame and recognition. While his stiletto wearing is remarkable, what's more remarkable is his substance. I had come full circle. I cite this talented young man because he created and crafted his career through the love and devotion of his grandmother, his education, and his solid confidence, clearly instilled at a young age. I can only imagine the confidence he had to get to the Los Angeles Times in stilettos. I think even Andy Warhol would not have tolerated me in heels on a daily basis. In 2020, one makes one's own rules. As long as you have knowledge to watch your back, dreams can come true for anyone who wants to become. Fear is no longer a barrier.
Yes, 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 yes. Andre.
When I tell you, but I mean, just a caveat question. Did you know about this? Like, were you able to read any of this before it came out?
So ironically, I had gotten an advance copy of the book because I had heard all of the drama around like the stuff he says about Anna Wintour in it. And Angela Leon Talley has long been a possibility model of mine. Anybody who knows me knows that. And so I just got the book because I was interested in reading it and maybe figuring out how I could, do a story on it. And so I was sitting on my couch reading a digital version of it and, saw my name and I was like, who is that? I'm sorry. It looks like my name. And it was, I literally screamed. It was a great experience. It's a great experience just to be seen, right? And to be seen by someone who feels as if you embody something that they once embodied. And, for me, it's very important to talk a lot about legacy and lineage. And as Black queer people who are writers, who are journalists, who are in these types of industries, sometimes we just don't know the stories of the folks that came before us. And sometimes it feels like we are paving our own paths. And so it was great to be recognized, both in the moment that we first met, because after the interview that we did initially, he didn't want to leave, and so we sat there for like another 5-10 minutes just like chatting away, and like that was a great moment, and to know that it had an impact enough on him for him to include it in his book was definitely a career highlight, if I will say.
Yes, I had to push that out. Oh, Amad, did you have something?
Yeah, I will say, do you, is there anyone else on your quote unquote bucket list career wise that you feel like it would be another career game changer for you to interview and or connect with?
I am, and I realize this is a very privileged statement, but I am blessed to have, particularly through my time at the LA Times, to have spoken with some of the biggest names, particularly in entertainment. I guess the only other person who I would say was like a major possibility model for me was Miss J. Alexander, who folks will remember as the runway coach, runway diva extraordinaire on America's Next Top Model. Miss J and Andre Leon Talley through America's Next Top Model were those kind of early possibility models for me in terms of like just kind of a gender expansiveness within a body that was assigned, a Black body specifically that was assigned male at birth. And so I haven't yet had the opportunity to interview Miss J. We have been in the same spaces, but I did not go up to them. And so I think that would be a great opportunity. I'm very early in my career still, praise the Lord. And so, who knows what's going to happen.
And then my last question, which is something that I thought about, could you give we may include this or we may not, but this is just something that I noticed from that moment. I wish that Andre would have contacted you about the proper pronouns to use, because I did feel that was a remiss detail to assume. In the future, what can you give people the rundown on how to properly identify Trevell the legendary?
So I actually answer to all pronouns. I do make use of they, them primarily, mainly because I want to force other people. I realize that I have a lot of privilege in terms of the spaces that I walk into, whether I'm hosting something or I'm giving a speech or something like that. And so forcing people to get used to using they, them as a pronoun, I think is in service of the rest of our community that uses they, them pronouns. But as for me, I answer to he, she, they, Beyonce, Queen,
I was gonna say
um,
slay.
whatever. But thanks for asking. I think it is important for us as a broader community to learn how to just get comfortable using non-gendered pronouns, and then even more so asking people their pronouns. This is a great example of like something that companies can do to create more safer, inclusive environments for some of the folks that might be within their building. And that's like simply when you're starting a meeting and you're introducing yourself, y'all are going around and saying your names, also have people say their pronouns, right? Make sure your pronouns are in your email signature and make that mandated across your company. Those are different, like small things that create a more supportive and inclusive work environment for members of the community that are already moving through a lot of these spaces, whether or not you know that they are there.
I mean, I just coming full circle, I didn't get to answer speak up on my answer. But my favorite article, one of my favorite articles from, Spectrum is How to Be an Ally. And I think it's perfect and very important and impactful for any ally to, understand their peers' pronouns and or speak on their behalf when they're not in that room to further hone in on being correct and in their usage of pronouns and things like that, and or like you said, opening the conversation in general so that it's not just something that's going unsaid and everybody's making their own rules, but it's something that promoting that conversation a little bit more, and so that we can have these conversations and it becomes a little bit more regular and normalized for these conversations to be had on a regular basis.
Yeah, and I think that's ultimately right how we see that how we shift cultures, right, within particular workplaces, but also broadly speaking in terms of how a lot of these entities are, trying to market and advertise to our communities.
Very good point, y'all. I just have one more question. It's really tied to the idea of identity in connection to corporate being, if you will, right? Because I think it's a great segue. So in the clip, Andre did mention that there had to be bravery working at the LA Times with your fabulous appearance, right? And presentation. What has been your experience in shaping your identity in the public at a corporate institution? And what are some giveaways and advice that you could offer someone who's younger, who may be on that journey as well?
I mean, I always say that, I was fashioned through the fire and the foolishness, and that foolishness and fire is exactly, some of the things that I went through with some people at the LA Times. They weren't all trash. And so I think ultimately what it comes down to is kind of a personal confidence and a personal security within one's identity. And then even more so being able, willing, and interested in, speaking up for oneself within a particular, corporate environment. A lot of times for us, we're just thankful to be there. We're thankful to have a job with health insurance and all of these other benefits that so many members of our community don't have. And so because of that, we feel like we don't have a place to demand more in terms of how we're, moving through a particular space. But one thing I always say is that, I was good at my job, and being good at my job allowed me to ask for certain things, for certain provisions. And then I also, it would be very subtle things that I would do to kind of carve out my space, right? And so, for example, in terms of like personnel, HR, platforms that we had to like upload our information into, and like they would ask for our gender, and it was only binary options, male, female, and I didn't fill it out. And it was a required question, so I couldn't proceed to fill out everything else. And so I simply emailed them and say, I won't be filling this out because you have gender like a binary options, and so it does not reflect my experience. And like little things like that eventually led to the LA Times broadening some of their, policies, procedures, and things like that, in terms of not only making the space more welcoming and supportive for me as an individual, but other LGBTQ folks who were in the newsroom, whether they knew they were there or not. However, to that end, I live in California. California is a very liberal place. We automatically have, based on our system out here, some provisions that support me being able to do a lot of those things. And so in this conversation, I often think about Amy Stevens, who actually recently just died, but she is a trans woman who was living in Shelby, Michigan. And when she notified her employer that she was intending to transition, she was fired. She subsequently sued them, and the case made its way all the way up to the Supreme Court. They heard the arguments for her case, but they have not yet made a decision on that case. And so she died without having her ability to not only transition, but to transition and still maintain employment, not reified by, you know, the largest body in this particular country. And so it's important for us to also look at kind of the socio-political ways that these conversations that we have about workplace experiences for LGBTQ people, particularly those Black and brown, particularly those trans and gender nonconforming, that we understand that a lot of this is like a patchwork of social protections across the country. And so, you know, the experience that I have here in California, in Los Angeles, unfortunately, is a different experience than someone like an Amy Stevens in Shelby, Michigan, or somebody in, you know, Idaho or somewhere else, you know, in the middle of the country that, or in the South, for example, that typically has more conservative ideas about identity and those things. And so it's important that we do the right thing and allow people to be called what they want to be called, to use the pronouns that they want to use, because once you make sure that these people are more welcome and more comfortable in your workplace, I promise you their work will improve as well.
I do have one piggyback off of that before we end. I know we were past time. What advice can you give to those who are at companies or are in states that don't support them? This is their livelihood that's on the line. Do I speak up do I speak up and lose my job, or do I stay suppressed and or oppressed and be unhappy at my job? That's one question. Second question is, for these companies who don't have these rules in place just yet, or these allowances in place yet, but fear, some of the arguments may be that, you know, it's just too much, you know, to cater to, it's too many people to cater to. What advice and or feedback could you give to them to maybe push them along to be a little bit more broad in their acceptances at the workplace?
Yeah, to answer your first question, I think, you know, this is a, you know, similar conversation, similar question that we often get from like other just like LGBTQ youth who want to know when they should come out and things like that. And ultimately what I always say is that your survival and your safety is paramount. And so if unfortunately that means that you have to, or you feel that you have to, you know, I don't want to say lie, but like not disclose certain things about your identity for the sake of you surviving and being able to pay your bills, particularly in this capitalist society that we live in. Like, I definitely understand that. I find it unfortunate and I hate it for you. But I understand that. And so I don't pass any judgment on anyone who looks at a life that like I live, right, where I'm a professional queer person, right? It's part of who I am, and you're gonna see it any way and any time that I show up in a particular space. But I understand folks who aren't able to do that, and so it's about their safety, it's about their comfort, it's about, you know, them being able to continue to, you know, live the life that they are living and enjoying, when they are able to enjoy. In terms of the companies on the other end, who say it's too much or who don't understand the imperative of creating these types of environments and providing these types of resources, I think ultimately what I would say is I would have the money conversation. I would have the bottom line conversation, because that's what we all care about anyway. And what we know, period, right, is that when employees are happy, when they feel supported by their company, they are willing to do the best work ever, right? So like that's one of the reasons why we see a lot of the major tech companies, your Facebooks, your Googles, they have these campuses that have 12 million food options. They have a gym on the campus. They have haircuts. They have healthcare right on the campus. It's because they want you to stay there. They want you to be comfortable. They want you to continue doing the work. Right. And so that's what I would say. You know, you want people to, you know, a lot of times these companies want you to give your life to them. Right. They want you to be dedicated. They want you to give the best of your intellectual power to them. But how can an individual do that if they feel like they're, you know, constantly preoccupied with hiding parts of themselves, both physically as well as spiritually and emotionally? And so I promise you, if people feel more comfortable, they're going to do better work, and better work for you is going to result in more money at the end of the day. And so I think ultimately that's what I would say. It's a dollar imperative ultimately. If the social reasons don't do enough for you, think about the money.
Yes, I love it. That's a period, honestly. Like I don't have anything else to say on that. I think we really hit all of the points so well, both from an inclusive marketing and inclusive management perspective. Trevell, I have to say again, from me, Ahmad, the Bold team, and everyone else, we appreciate you. We appreciate you for coming in and really taking Spectrum and doing exactly what we expected, and even more, as you will do anyway. And we look forward to working with you again. There's much more to be done. We think it's a good start to something that, of course, is going to have to be continuous. So I appreciate it. Go ahead, Mom.
Backing off of that, I mean, what can people be on the lookout for from you in the near future? I know you have Fanti.
Oh, yes. I co-host a podcast called Fanti with a fellow politics and pop culture journalist, Jared Hill. It's all about the complex and complicated conversations about the gray areas in our lives. The people that you love, that you're big fans of, but have some anti-feelings toward. And then I'm a general freelancer out in these streets. And so you can just, you know, follow me on Twitter at Trevell Anderson to stay up to date in terms of the things that I'm doing.
Perfect. Push your coins at Trevell Anderson. You won't be disappointed at all. All right.
Thank y'all.
Thank y'all.